All right, so I'm going to hand the mic to Eric. And again, he's going to present sort of how we have translated the scenarios into model inputs, which we will then be simulating for understanding implications for food, energy, water, and ecosystems into the future. So take it away, Eric.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jenny, and welcome everyone. Thanks for taking your lunch break with us today to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive into the model inputs that are going to be headed into the model here soon. I know this has been a long process of gathering feedback and kind of walking through the whole process and kind of co-developing these with a lot of you on this call. So we appreciate your time and effort and patience. And so the next time we see each other, we'll have actual some model results to show from the scenarios. But wanted to take this opportunity to just do, again, a little bit of a deeper dive into what's actually going into the models for these 2050 scenarios. And really, we're going to concentrate on two big categories today. Kind of what is the landscape looking like in 2050 in each of these scenarios? And then what kind of nutrients and how many are we applying onto that landscape? So I'm going to lead the show today, but I'll hand it over to Kelsey to talk a little bit about the climate projections as part of this modeling. Okay, so a little bit of an outline. It might be a little bit rushed, but please keep questions in mind, and we'll have some time at the end to take some of those. But I'm going to give kind of a general approach of how we've done the scenarios up to this point, and then provide a little bit of context on some recent changes in the Upper Mississippi Basin and how that's kind of impacting the trajectories into these four scenarios out to 2050. And then we'll really dig into kind of, okay, what does the model need in terms of these different scenarios? And then we'll end, I guess, with some next steps. So I want to start with just a quote, just to get us into the right mindset, maybe, of thinking about 2050. Again, it's not something that we always do in our day-to-day life. So I'm just going to read it real quick. We must dare to think unthinkable thoughts. We must learn to explore all the options and possibilities that confront us in a complex and rapidly changing world. We must learn to welcome and not to fear the voices of dissent. We must dare to think about unthinkable things, because when things become unthinkable, thinking stops and action becomes mindless. So I first saw this quote at the beginning of a different scenario planning exercise report a while ago, and thought it was kind of a helpful way to get into that mindset. And we've been doing scenarios for a long time. This is a quote from 1964. This was a U.S. senator at the time, but it sometimes is hard to get into that space, and I just want to make sure that we open things up to think broadly about what the potential futures could be. And then a little bit more context. I've done this recently with some other presentations, and I hope it's useful, but I just want to make it clear that I am a human being and I have my own personal thoughts about the future, and certainly working on this project, I've been thinking a lot about it. So I just want to kind of pull the curtain open a little bit into my positionality here. And I think personally, this is a really fascinating moment to be thinking about 2050. We're at the crossroads in terms of a lot of different things, whether it's adapting and mitigating to an increasingly warm and extreme climate, or the accelerating transition to renewable energy. Certainly, a lot of us on this call are thinking about heightened water quality risks, and nitrating groundwater is kind of a big one. And so I personally think, charting a course of conviction requires incorporating a diverse set of perspectives. And that's what I've tried to do. That's what we've tried to do with this project. But again, I have my own personal biases and subjectiveness, and I can't eliminate those completely here. And so I want to just be clear on where I'm coming from as a person researching these questions, while at the same time trying to incorporate all these different perspectives into these scenarios. So to back up on the project and the scenarios itself, again, the main objective here is to assess the extent to which various desirable futures can meet these collective goals around food, energy, water, and ecosystem needs. And we've again come along on this process together. We've held discussions about some of these shared goals and really thought deeply about what and how much should the basin produce, provide, and support in terms of food, energy, water, and ecosystem security. And we held discussions to explore kind of in a more quantitative ways, like what are these goals and what are the pathways. Kind of did this backcasting exercise that Jenny led. And then we tried to synthesize all this feedback that we received through these different workshops. And last December, we kind of gave you a taste or a draft of these scenario narratives that we're going to kind of go deeper in today. And those goals, those kind of shared goals that we came up together, it was hard to kind of dial in on some exact numbers that everyone could agree on, but they cross these different dimensions. And we also pointed towards other sources, whether it was the USDA and increasing agricultural production by 40%, or some in government wanting net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And then I think the one that we tend to think about the most in terms of the water sector is these hypoxia task force goals of reducing nutrient loss by 45%. And then lastly, there's also this effort around conservation, the 30 by 30 initiative. Again, not everybody is going to be agreeing on those exact numbers, but when we talk about shared goals, it's kind of swirling in these different dimensions and in these numbers. So that's kind of what we mean when we're aiming towards these fuzzy targets in 2050. So these four normative scenarios are going to do the following, or we kind of design them to do the following. Again, represent a wide range of viewpoints, preferences, and values that came from these workshops. We really want them to contrast with one another. It just makes it a lot more interesting and helpful, I think, to look at contrasts. And of course, they need to be plausible by the year 2050. And that can be debated amongst us, but that's just one of the aspects that we're looking for. And that they could reasonably result in meeting some of these shared goals by 2050. We really wanted to push it and make them kind of transformative and at times somewhat provocative, because these are big goals that we are shooting for. And our general approach here, again, I use the word normative, and so these are scenarios about what should be done to accomplish stated goals. There's a lot of other scenario exercises out there that kind of look at this wide space of plausible futures. And most of the folks on this team did a semi-similar exercise for the Yahara watershed in Wisconsin that really pushed on what was plausible. This is a little bit more confined in terms of desirable futures. We're not going off into dystopias here. We're really looking at what we want to see happen in 2050. And the scenarios themselves are going to consist of narratives, which again, I shared some drafts of last December. And these kind of describe the different elements in the scenario and making sure that it's kind of internally consistent. It kind of talks a little bit about policy and maybe what social and economic dimensions are happening in the scenario. But then the model itself, that's taking that information and we're estimating kind of the biophysical consequences of that narrative happening, specifically the land management decisions that are happening within the narrative. So I think it's important to understand that us as a research group, we are better at estimating some things more than others. So we have a lot of experience around water quality impacts of land use and management change. We are not well versed in trying to estimate socio-techno-political economic changes into the future. And I know there are a lot of other groups out there that try to do that with models, but that's not what we're doing here. We are not modeling the economics from today all the way to 2050. Those aspects of the scenarios are coming from the narratives. So they're kind of a priori assumptions about social and political and economic dimensions. And then we're taking that and putting it into the model to figure out what are some of these biophysical consequences. So another way to look at that is this schematic here is we start again with these scenario narratives around these different dimensions, whether it's the food, energy system, different policies, consumer demand. And we really whittle that down into what the model needs. And that, again, is what is the landscape looking like and how many nutrients are we applying to it? So it's stripped down quite a bit from its detail. And then we feed that into the model, and the model, again, estimates those consequences and outputs things like biomass production. And we're also going to be incorporating the climate and how it changes out to 2050. And then another big dimension here, again, is water quality and quantity, and that's something that we can get out of the model. And then a little bit outside the model is, okay, what do we do with that biomass production? And that's where the narratives actually come back into the picture. And we need to figure out, what do we do with the corn or the soy that is produced, or other crops or pasture in each of these scenarios? What happens to those elements? Do they get turned into biofuels? Do they get turned into different aspects of our food system? So that will be an element, but it's kind of outside of the model itself. Okay, so that's our general approach. And I wanted to give a little bit of context about recent changes in the basin, just to, again, get into this mindset of change. Change has happened in the past. It will continue to happen. One of the big changes that we've seen in the basin over the last 20 years only is a major shift in how we use the corn that is produced in the basin. And here are just some statistics to keep in mind, and looking at two snapshots in time. The year that I was born, 1981, we basically didn't produce any corn-based ethanol. But jump to 2023, we're now taking about 2 billion bushels of our corn produced in the basin and sending it to an ethanol plant, and also getting dried distiller's grain out of that process as well. But we're taking about 12 million acres of corn production area and turning that into ethanol. So that represents about 10% of the basin area, which is a major change in how that landscape is kind of used to produce something. And keep in mind, I'm going to compare this with another statistic later. This is producing in 2023 over the entire basin about 39 petajoules of energy per year. It's not a typical unit you might think about, but just keep that in the back of your mind. And also keep in mind that this production of corn grain ethanol is different from state to state. We see kind of lower numbers in Illinois compared to Iowa and South Dakota. But that's kind of the way that I estimated this for the basin, is kind of assuming these different ratios for each state. And what that looks like in terms of how corn is used, kind of this post-processing step, we have this blue area that basically wasn't there 20 years ago. We're still using a lot of corn for feed to livestock, and we're also exporting a lot to other countries, which ends up as feed primarily as well. And then this darker blue here is this percentage, around 10%, that gets directly used into human food products. So again, this picture has changed a lot. in the last 20 years and is potentially going to change in the future. Another big change recently, even more recent than the last 20 years, is the real boom in renewable energy and specifically solar production. And these are some numbers from the Energy Information Administration. And we're producing back in 2022, like these numbers are already pretty outdated. We are producing about 13 petajoules of energy from solar production. So about a third of what we are producing with corn ethanol on that same basin-wide look. And then wind is a separate thing, but it's producing about 20 times that amount of energy. So just kind of putting into context when we're thinking about using the basin for energy purposes, these renewable energy sources are already more than biofuels, and they're likely growing a lot, will grow a lot more in the future. And again, we can break this out by the different states if you're interested, but these are kind of the data sets that I use to estimate this. And a little bit more here again on this idea of accelerated growth in solar energy. And it's really hard to keep up with this with literature, and I won't pretend to be an expert in this, but there are a lot of modelers trying to model kind of this innovation and deployment of renewables. And we haven't been very good at estimating deployment rates in the last few years just because it's been moving so rapidly. And so this is the cost of electricity and for solar PV through the last several decades, and it's just kind of taking this logarithmic decline. But then this paper just recently came out, I think putting it pretty succinctly here, that we find that due to technological trajectories set in motion by past policy, a global irreversible solar tipping point may have passed, where solar energy gradually comes to dominate global electricity markets without any further climate policies necessary. So it's just, again, this has happened fairly quickly. Even in the last year or so, I think many in this space have come to realize that we're kind of at this tipping point, and it's just going to accelerate really, really quickly. And so what comes to my mind is, okay, what does this mean for the basin? We need to keep this in mind when we think about 2050. So I'm just presenting this as a little bit of context for why you might see some of the things that you see in the scenarios. And then lastly, the last bit of context, because you'll see it show up in one of the scenarios, is this question, okay, we're seeing this electrification happen rapidly. What about some of the hard to electrify transportation? And specifically, aviation gets talked about a lot. And again, this is something that is moving really, really quickly and hard to keep up with. This is an article that just came out yesterday with a North Dakota State University economist saying that recent changes to tax credits for sustainable aviation fuel is this kind of watershed moment for the industry potentially. And there's certainly a lot of interest in some research about what this might look like if it starts increasing in production. So there's a wide variety of feedstocks that might go into aviation fuel. It's biomass-based aviation fuel, and there's certainly an ongoing debate about the role of corn and soy in that feedstock. So those are kind of the ideas around energy that are swirling in my mind that are going to be impacting some of the scenarios here. Okay, so how could the basin look in 2050 with a sustained commitment to accomplishing these shared goals? And the best way I can put it in a succinct way, and this is kind of how my mind has navigated the creation of these four scenarios. It starts with this question that's related to electrification, but is more about biofuels. So will liquid biofuels still be a substantial form of energy for the transportation sector in 2050? If the answer to that is yes, we are up here in scenario one, which I'm calling, just for shorthand here, the cropland conservation scenario. And This is where biofuels are still being produced, primarily corn ethanol, but some soy as well, to produce aviation fuel. Um, but on a cropland landscape that has a lot of uh, best management practice adoption. If the answer to this question is no, we are not producing biofuels as a substantial form of energy, then the next question is, okay, we know we have a lot of land devoted to that today. And if that demand goes away, what do we use that land for? And that's where we come up with two other scenarios. Um, that land is basically converted to more of a perennial agricultural system in scenario two. Or in scenario three, we are really going all in on restoring ecosystems, whether it's forests or grasslands or wetlands. Um, and then the fourth is kind of a mixture of each of those three scenarios. And it's called just kind of the mixed approach. And I will say that I hesitated from doing kind of the mixed approach because people sometimes tend to gravitate towards the thing in the middle. But through the feedback, I think a lot of people wanted to see something like that in this package. And so that's kind of the justification for kind of mixing all these things together into one. So there a little bit of biofuel production, but also a little bit of ecosystem restoration and perennial agriculture. Um, so those are the dominant questions that kind of went through my mind in creating these scenarios, but certainly there are other factors involved, whether it's how diets have changed and what that means for demand of these different crops, and then agricultural exports, like how are we supplying the rest of the world in 2050? But this is, yeah, the dominant pathway in my mind. Okay, so that's what we have for kind of the overview of the scenario. So what specifically does the model need from those different narratives? So AgriIBIS, I'm going to just give a quick little summary. You probably have heard this before in a few of our other presentations, if you recall. It's this process-based simulation of the different cycles of water, energy, carbon, and nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're growing plants in the model. We're accounting for soil moisture and nutrients, and even historical legacies in the soil and how they impact how plants are grown. And they need inputs, or this model needs inputs, whether it's weather and climate, land use, land cover, the nutrients, even irrigation. Those things can change through time, obviously, and then we have a bunch of static inputs like soil type and slope. And specifically for the land use and land cover, we've got a bunch of different categories that we can represent on the landscape. So before I go into the scenarios themselves, I'll talk a little bit about how we came up with the historical data sets, and because it's kind of a handoff between the historical inputs and then the scenario inputs. And it has to be kind of the seamless transition. So I'm going to show you some inputs from 2020 as kind of this current snapshot. And what I did was I really relied on the Census of Agriculture to give us estimates of crop type areas at the county scale, and kind of setting that as the truth in terms of area. And then using the National Land Cover Database to get the other land use, land cover areas and the proportions within a given county. And then within a county, how to spatially allocate those different areas. We would use data sets like the cropland data layer and look at where corn, for instance, might be growing within a county, and then we would have a higher likelihood that corn would be there today and even into the future, kind of assuming that today's corn kind of frequency is similar to the futures. So let me run through a quick example to illustrate what I mean by those methods. So if we look at Dane County, this is where Madison is, if you're not aware. But from the Census of Agriculture in 2017, we have an estimate of the amount of corn harvested area. And then we can look at the cropland data layer from 2020 and see where things are grown. And if you're not familiar with the cropland data layer, the yellow here is corn. And if we just isolate that here, again, at this 30-meter resolution, this is where corn is being grown in 2020. But for the model, we're not actually doing it at that high of a resolution. We're doing it at about a kilometer resolution, just in terms of the computational limitations that we have. So what we do is, in order to preserve that area, we'll first figure out, okay, within a 1 kilometer grid cell, what is the frequency of corn grown in that grid cell? And so it goes from 0 to 1. And so with that information, I can impose this area that the Census of Agriculture is giving me and come up with a map of corn, which is again here in yellow, that is at the right resolution, but has the correct area that the census is telling me. So that's kind of the process for corn, but it's a similar process for the other crop types and for the other land cover types. Then for the nutrients, again, we need to estimate the historical inputs of nutrients and then hand it off to these future scenarios. So for the current and historical data sets, we're relying on data from the USGS that has estimated county scale fertilizer mass, and then downscaling those county scale numbers using just the idea that we know that there are differences in crop demand, or you can think of differences in terms of the amount of recommended fertilizer you would apply to a given crop. So these are some of the assumptions that we made for the basin for the different crop types. And just by knowing the overall fertilizer mass that we need to add up to for a given county, we can back calculate what are going to be the fertilizer rates for each of these crop types, assuming that you've got these ratios constant through time. So for instance, wheat for nitrogen fertilizer is going to be about 39% of what we're giving to corn. So it's just a little assumption or a trick that we can use in order to calculate the fertilizer rates for all of these different crop types. For manure, and I'll illustrate this in a second, going back to our Dane County example. For manure, the process is a little bit easier. It does rely, though, on a simplification assumption again. So we have county scale manure production data from the USGS based on livestock data from the Census of Agriculture. And what we're doing is we're just uniformly applying that across agricultural land within a county. We really don't have much else to go on in terms of distributing manure. We clearly know that it's not uniformly distributed, but without knowing kind of where these livestock operations are, we just don't have a good way of distributing it variably across a county. So again, if we go back to our Dane County example, and we just look at the agricultural land here and note that corn again is yellow and darker green is going to be soybean. So if I show you the fertilizer nitrogen rates for 2020, using that method that I just outlined, these are the fertilizer rates that we calculate for Dane County. And so it depends on what the land use land cover map is giving us, but it also depends on that fertilizer mass estimate from the USGS. For manure, again, we're spreading it uniformly across the county. And for this particular year, it ends up being about 52 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Again, we know it's not spread uniformly. We know there are some focused points where manure is applied in the county, but since we're doing this across the entire basin, we just have to kind of work with those assumptions. So yeah, I walked through those methods for the current snapshots of 2020. But the reason I wanted to make them clear though is we're really not modifying them that much for 2050. We're just kind of adjusting the dials at the county scale, whether it's the area devoted to corn or other land cover types or the amount of nutrients or manure. Um, we're just going to kind of dial those up or down depending on the scenario and then kind of spatially allocate them in a similar way. So I went through this again last December. I'm not going to read through the entire narrative, but I'll give you just a few high points in terms of the limited time we have today. But scenario one is kind of this cropland conservation scenario. Again, we're producing some aviation fuel from our corn and soy feedstocks. But there's substantial implementation of various BMPs on that cropland. So about 75% of cropland is getting like no-till and cover crops, which I realize is a very high number. But we're really trying to push the envelope as much as possible with these scenarios. And this one, we're really going in on BMP adoption. So what does that look like? It actually doesn't end up looking that different from 2020. And I'll kind of go back and forth here, showing you the percentages of the different land covers on the right, and then the map itself on the left. So if I show you 2020, if you squint, you actually don't see all that much of a change. And again, that's consistent here with the story. We are keeping the same footprint, but we are just doing a heck of a lot more conservation practices and BMPs on that existing cropland. And the way that we're using the corn and soy is changing kind of in that post-processing step. So for scenario two, this does have more of a change here. This is the perennial agriculture scenario. And again, we're assuming that the biofuels are not a substantial part of our energy system in this scenario. And so the question is, what do we do with a lot of that cropland that was previously devoted to that use? And here we're emphasizing a transition to perennial agriculture, whether it's managed grazing or maybe agrivoltaics, some agroforestry. That's what we have in mind when we are thinking about perennial agriculture. So what does that look like on the landscape? So pasture here is kind of this teal color, and you just see a lot more of it spread throughout the entire basin. And it's not uniformly changed in terms of that knob. So parts of Iowa, the percentage of the cropland that gets transitioned might be a little bit lower than in other areas. But you can compare it to 2020 and go back and forth a little bit. But you do see this kind of widespread transition of a lot of the cropland to this perennial agricultural system. So then to keep things moving along, scenario three, again, this is a little bit of review from last December if you were here, but important to kind of get you back up to speed. So three is, again, that same question, what happens to that landscape that was previously used for biofuel? Here we're emphasizing the idea of restoring ecosystems for non-agricultural purposes. And in order to make that work in this scenario, this is the one where we see the most shift, the most change in terms of human diets away from meat and dairy consumption, just to make kind of the internal logic of the scenario consistent. So again, that kind of comes on the back end of the scenario where we think about what we're producing in terms of food calories for this scenario. So what does that look like? We just have, again, similar to the pasture or the perennial agriculture scenario, we're replacing some of that cropland, but instead of perennial ag, we're replacing it with a mix of forest and some grassland and some wetland. And again, relying on where those things were kind of located in 2020, but just turning the knob on actually transitioning that pixel to one of these natural land covers. And so we see, if you want to look at forest growth between the two, so it goes from about 19% in 2020 to 28% in 2050. And then finally, this kind of mixed approach where we are taking a little bit from each of the three scenarios and only converting about 15% of cropland to either a restored non-agricultural ecosystem and a perennial ag system. And the remaining cropland is also going to have more of a conservation practice deployment or adoption. And as you might expect, it's just a little bit of a hodgepodge of each of those three scenarios when we look at the map. And again, we can compare it to 2020. And while we don't see quite as much of those changes, we do see a little bit in terms of the pasture or that perennial ag and some of these other natural vegetation categories. Okay, so those are the maps. I'm going to keep us moving along. So those are critical then for the next step of, okay, we've got these different landscapes. What are we going to apply to them in terms of nutrients? And specifically, we're talking about the agricultural landscape. So what I'm doing here is for each scenario, I've got two knobs, or actually three, I guess, that I'm dialing up or down, I guess, in most of these cases. So the first knob is what I'm calling the fertilizer adjustment factor. And what this is doing is it's scaling those 2020 fertilizer application rates that I showed an example for Dane County. It's just dialing those down by a certain percentage. So for instance, our scenario one, this cropland conservation scenario, we're dialing that down by 25%. So a pretty big jump in that fertilizer. And then not quite as much in scenario 2 or 3, but keep in mind that there's just less cropland in those two scenarios. The other knob that I'm going to be adjusting is the livestock adjustment factor. And here I'm talking specifically about confined livestock. So for the scenarios, I'm going to distinguish between confined and unconfined livestock, or you can think of livestock on a perennial system or pasture. So the livestock adjustment or the confined livestock adjustment factor is really dialing things down depending on those the different scenario narratives. So for scenario one, we are actually dialing down or we're not dialing down that livestock at all. We're keeping it constant. So that's this purple bar here. But for scenarios 2 and 3, we're cutting down the confined livestock proportion in scenario 2 because we have a bunch more out on perennial systems, on pastures. But for scenario 3, it's dialed down by half, mostly because, again, the cropland has been transitioned, but we're also seeing a shift in diet away from meat and dairy. And then scenario 4, again, is kind of a mix between these three. We are seeing a substantial amount of fertilizer decline, but not quite as much in terms of livestock, for instance, confined livestock. For the pasture or the unconfined livestock, we're just assuming that we have kind of a little less than a half of an animal, and you can think of a beef cattle per acre. It seems maybe a little conservative, but what we're trying to represent there is making sure that we have enough land base to support an animal year long. So some of that pasture might actually be used as hay to be fed outside of the grazing season. And my colleague Randy Jackson kind of used a similar assumption for doing some calculations, kind of back of the envelope calculations for the basin under a different scenario approach. So what does that mean for the ultimate maps of fertilizer and manure? I'll just show you kind of one example because again, I've got these maps for all four scenarios, but this is what it looks like for scenario one, that cropland conservation scenario. And so we're seeing about a 25% decline in the amount of fertilizer applied for that scenario. This is the orange bar here. And for all four scenarios, we're seeing in terms of the total nitrogen or the total phosphorus, we're seeing less compared to 2020. And that shouldn't be a huge surprise because as part of our collective goal of reaching a water quality a threshold, or I guess a water quality goal, we know we need to bring down nutrient inputs to the landscape. And so that's a consistent thing that you see across these four scenarios, but it's happening in different ways and in terms of different magnitudes. So the way that these maps are calculated at the end are really a function of how much cropland area is in a given scenario, that fertilizer intensity on that cropland, the confined livestock population, as well as how much pasture and the manure associated with those grazed animals. The final dimension here that I'll show is related to how the cropland in each of the scenario is managed, aside from nutrients. And here we wanted to really give a variety of outcomes in terms of that management, depending on the scenario. So for scenario one, we have cropland conservation again. What we're doing is we're really turning the dial up on best management practices and putting cover crops at about 75% of the cropland. And then the other element here that is going to mostly happen kind of in a post-processing step in our modeling. We are not modeling edge of field treatment practices at kind of the kilometer scale in our model, but we'll be relying on kind of literature values for what are reasonable nutrient reduction percentages for these different treatment techniques. And we'll just assume different proportions of the cropland that gets treated. And so a high level of treatment in that scenario one and lower for the other three. And again, this is something I'd be happy to talk with you more about. This kind of deployment of edge of field treatment, I think, is something we are very uncertain about, and how much that would cost, what it would look like, what it would require in terms of public subsidies or labor even. So yeah, happy to talk with others that have maybe thought about that in their own work. All right, so with that, I'll switch it over to Kelsey to talk about the climate inputs that are going to interface with these other model inputs.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and I'll keep this pretty short just so there's enough time to answer questions at the end.
Great.
So in our current projects throughout the Fusescapes project, we've been working with future global climate model data, which has come from this multivariate adaptive constructed analogs data set, also known as MACA. And this group that has created this downscaled, bias-corrected future climate model data has also created the GridMet weather inputs, which I believe is what we are also using for the historical weather data. So this is coming from the same group. So we're very familiar with the style of this, the weather inputs. The cool factor about this MACA data set is it includes the entire suite of CMIP-5 future global climate models. So there's 20 different global climate models that are included within this. And like I mentioned before, that they've all been statistically downscaled and bias corrected for the US. So this means that it's basically, they're ready to use for the scales of the simulations that we're currently working at, which is the Upper Mississippi River Basin. And so this is one set of the data, one portion of the future climate data sets are required for the future simulations we will be running. Another required input is future CO2 concentration data for different warming scenarios. So if you're not familiar with an RCP, it is a representative concentration pathway, and it's basically like the warming projection scenario that's used for these global climate models. So RCP 4.5 is this blue line on the figure on the far right. Thank you, Eric. And it's not as steep of an incline in CO2 concentrations than the RCP 8.5, which is in orange. And so these can be associated with higher degrees of warming under these future scenarios. So if you can go to the next slide, Eric. So one thing that we want to make sure we're including when we're selecting global climate models is that we're representing a combination of, in a wide range of future elevated temperatures, as well as a wide range in precipitation. So as we know, precipitation variability is more likely to increase under future climate. So we want to make sure that we're grabbing global climate models that account for both warming or dry as well as wet conditions across the region. And so that's one of the methods that we use. Another method that, after speaking with some climate scientists here at UW, that all of the 20 GCMs kind of get an equal vote. So it's like a democracy here. And so not one is better than the other. And as long as we're grabbing enough that are providing this range of temperatures and precipitation for these different conditions, that we'll be able to assess the full range of weather variability on these future scenarios that Eric has created. And so we have selected 3 global climate models for 2 RCPs, so the 4.5 and 8.5. So that's a total of 6 different future climate conditions out to the year 2050. And so the resolution that this data comes at is originally a 4-kilometer resolution, and we have some scripts that downscale this to 1-kilometer resolution, which is the same method that has been done for the historical weather inputs that we are using at the moment within these simulations. So yeah, and like I mentioned, we've worked with these before, and so this method to us and these data sets to us aren't necessarily new. So this will be a great way for us to no downtime, I guess, when it comes to running the future scenarios. We can just jump right into it.
Awesome.
Yep.
Great.
Thanks,
Thanks, Kelsey. So we've got these 3 different GCMs and 2 different represent concentration pathways. So 4 scenarios times those different climates. What we're thinking about, or what we're looking at, is 24 total model simulations. And just to give a little bit of a range, like Kelsey explained, in the different climate outcomes associated with these scenarios. The last piece of this that is yet to be finalized, and again, if people have questions or thoughts about this, I'd love to hear them, is this question of, okay, how fast is the transition going to be between kind of the initial state, or today, current conditions, and what we're showing you is happening in 2050. There are a lot of different ways you could do that, as you might imagine. The one here I'm proposing is something that we kind of ended up at as a team, but if others have deep thoughts or convictions about other ways to do it, we're open to hearing those. The idea, though, is we're not going to see a change overnight, but we also want to see it happen relatively quickly in order for some of the benefits to start being seen by 2050. Maybe not fully realizing the benefits, because we know there are lags in the system, but at least kind of getting to this new state on the landscape by 2050. And what that might mean is we simulate out a little bit further beyond 2050. So again, happy to talk a little bit more about that. But the last few slides here, I'm just going to talk about next steps, and we'll finalize these model inputs at the annual scale, run all the simulations, do some of that post-processing about, okay, what is happening to that biomass that we're simulating. And so we can convert that to things like energy in petajoules or whatever unit you'd like, and food in terms of food calories or other components of our diet. Like we really want to get to that granular level, and compare across the different scenarios. And then the next time we present, we'll have those results, and we'd be open for feedback at that point. We have a lot of metrics that we could provide from the model. It's just going to be a matter of how best to present those and what to kind of concentrate on. Again, water quality, I think, has been a major theme among this group that we'll highlight for sure. But as I showed in this early diagram, I think it's also really important to talk about the energy and the food outcomes in each of these scenarios. So we'll definitely be focusing on that as well. So thanks for sticking with me and going a little bit down in the weeds. And sorry I didn't have a little bit more time for some questions, but I can stay a little bit past 12:30 if others are able to.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. There are some questions in the chat that we can work through.
Great.
So Ben Becker asked, under the yes or no option for the 2050 scenarios, is it an all or nothing for biofuels, or could a shift in energy focus still include biofuels or other carbon-based energy for high energy transport industry?
Yeah. So the scenario one certainly is kind of highlighting an upper bound maybe for aviation fuel adoption, and then scenario 4 is representing a little bit of a mix. So I hope that they're covered between the two of those. There isn't much being produced in scenarios 2 and 3, again, just to represent kind of a contrast. And if you want to think more about it, and kind of add to the narrative, I guess, those might be scenarios where we have just other fuels that have come online for aviation. And certainly, again, this is an area that is moving quickly, whether it's hydrogen or for longer haul flights, or a lot of development in just electrification in short haul aviation. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question.
And the next question is from Timothy Bay. That's can you briefly define from your perspective an ecosystem service or an eco-service market and how that market works?
Yeah, totally, Tim. You can define it much better than I can. But yeah, I wanted to include that in that narrative specifically. So this was scenario 3, where ecosystem restoration is emphasized. In my mind, there needed to be at least some element to the narrative that provided a revenue source for a private landowner to do that conversion, right? So if there are other mechanisms for that to happen, I'm certainly not. I'm open to those other mechanisms, but that was kind of what I was hinting at there. It could be an ecosystem service market. It could be public subsidies. But there, in my mind, again, it needed to have some kind of revenue source to support a private landowner in doing that kind of a transition.
And the next question comes from Brian Austin, and that's, will you run scenarios where recommended N rates may in practice be quite often exceeded? This might be to explain the high N content we presently find in GWSW data. Would be interesting to compare what may be actually happening on the landscape versus scenarios where recommended rates are utilized universally or applied rates are throttled back.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Brian. Certainly in 2020, based on our kind of use of the USGS data sets, there are places where, yeah, N rates are higher than recommendations, even at kind of that county scale. Maybe just 2 points, I guess. The first is these scenarios, again, are kind of normative and desirable future. So we really are emphasizing on dialing down nitrogen from where we are in 2020. And certainly there's value in doing scenarios that are maybe more realistic in your mind or in anybody's mind, and maybe even continuing current trends. But that's just a different exercise than what we're trying to do here. And I guess the second point is, even in some of the scenarios, since we're dialing down the current fertilizer application rates, even dialing them down a little bit in some places, you could still have higher than recommended amounts, just because there are some areas that we are just over applying by quite a bit. So there will be that represented spatially, but overall, we're lowering kind of the fertilizer mass at the basin scale.
Right. And then Mark Ellis asks, Zach McKieran of NOAA has been working on downscaled climate models for the upper Mississippi River Basin to predict discharge. The ensemble does not consider land use, land cover change. Could your inputs be tweaked for inclusion in other models such as NOAA's?
Yeah, definitely open to collaborating with others, kind of after we're seeing the other end of these model simulations, and starting to get these out into the world. But yeah, I don't know, maybe Chris, do you have any thoughts about that? Or Kelsey?
I guess I'd have to learn a little bit more about what Noah's trying to do there and what, I mean, yeah, it would be nice to make use of what we're doing and other things that are going on by others, obviously, but probably deserves a follow-up conversation at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. I think a lot of climate modelers are becoming more interested in the feedback with landscape and the climate projections, like the IPCC ones. I don't know well enough how kind of the land use, land cover scenarios are implemented and projected. So I think there's room for improvement or collaboration for sure.
So there's one
Thanks.
more question. There's one more question in the chat, and I know we had sort of one question that we wanted to throw back to you all. So if folks are willing and able to stay a little bit longer, we'd appreciate it. But the one question left in the chat is from Roger. How would the model handle? Wait, I'm not reading well. How would model handle that some geographies may have disproportionate levels of importance of water uses and impacts, and that the land management changes may also be disproportionate? I don't know if I read that.
Yeah. So in terms of the changes happening in each of the scenarios, there isn't a ton of kind of spatial variability. So for instance, the scenarios where cropland is converted to more perennial agriculture, like that's happening pretty uniformly across the whole basin. We just didn't get a ton of consensus on there being a specific focus in one place over another for these types of changes to occur. But certainly in reality, we know that things get adopted differently in different places. So yeah, I think it's just one of the limitations that we had with our approach. But on the second point, certainly there's going to be disproportionate impacts of these changes across the watershed. And that's actually one of the big values of having a model to help us estimate some of those impacts, because it can sometimes just be non-intuitive what these model results are going to end up looking like.
Cool. And thanks everyone for those questions in the chat. And the one question that, just to circle back on that, and Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we did want to get sort of folks' reactions to that transition question of sort of how long should the transition be? So
yeah,
what's left in the room, we'd love your feedback on that that big question right now. And Eric, if you want to remind people of the comments for that.
I can put that slide back up quick. So yeah, again, we know it's not going to happen overnight. Like you could represent these changes as a step change in 2025 and just see how it plays out. But we kind of thought that a transition of some time period would need to take place. And then knowing that the results of that transition might play out beyond 2050. So there's not a right or wrong answer, I guess, here, but just if people have thoughts on that, or maybe what you've done in other similar exercises.
Yeah, what do folks think of this trajectory for the transition, and does it feel like a comfortable, reasonable space to be working in, or would you like to see something different? And we can assume silence as you're okay with it.
Not too many people have thought about what this transition looks like, and that's totally fine. It's been eating away at me for the last several months.
This is Mark from UMRBA. I think I
Yeah.
would just say, in lieu of any information that would tell you otherwise, I don't see any other intuitive way to do it.
Right.
Yeah, it just seems like until somebody shows a different type of acceleration of adoption, there's really nothing else you can do, I think.
Yeah. Great. That's helpful. Thanks, Mark.
Any other reactions that folks want to provide?
Or other questions that people have too.
All right.
Say,
Well,
this
sorry,
is
go ahead.
Roger. Oh, I'm sorry. This is
Oh, go
Roger.
for it.
I was just, thinking about transitions, it might be the policy space that impacts this, right?
Absolutely.
Incentives or disincentives. That would probably be one of the main drivers. And, that's the first thing that popped into my head.
Yeah, thanks for that, Roger. I totally agree. I think just to keep the scenarios in terms of like apples to apples comparison, we would do the same kind of transition ramp up across the board, but certainly that's another dimension that could be looked at with a future study is how those different transitions will ultimately impact what 2050 looks like. But yeah, sometimes policy can lead to major changes in 10 years or even less. So,
Well, that's what renewable fuel did.
right.
Standard.
Yep.
Right. Any last questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and I thank you all especially for sticking around a few extra minutes. In terms of that next discussion, where we will be presenting to you the model results for your reactions and sort of discussion around the implications. We anticipate that will happen around early to mid-spring of 2025, just given sort of what needs to happen between now and then. So you'll hear from us probably sometime late winter, early spring of 2025 for that next step of the process. Yeah, I guess that's, I think, pretty much what we have for you all today. So thank you all again so much. And we look forward to seeing you in the spring, if not sooner. We know this process has taken a little bit of time, and we appreciate you all for sticking with us. And we're really excited to see what's going to come of the model results and sort of what we all think that might mean for what we do today.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you for all the work.